February 19, 1945. The black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima stretched before 30,000 United States Marines. As landing craft slammed against the shore, the island looked dead, silent. For 2 precious minutes, the Marines moved inland unopposed, boots sinking into ash-colored ground that seemed to swallow sound itself. Then the earth exploded. Artillery shells screamed from invisible positions. Machine gun fire erupted from rocks that seconds before had appeared empty. Men fell in waves across the beach, and those who survived quickly understood a terrifying truth. Their enemy was not on this island. He was in it. The tunnels of Iwo Jima represented something unprecedented in modern warfare. While Americans had fought through jungles in Guadalcanal and waded through blood-soaked surf at Tarawa, nothing had prepared them for an enemy who could vanish into stone and reappear behind their lines at will. These were not simple caves or hastily dug foxholes. They were engineered fortresses carved from volcanic rock, some descending 75 feet below the surface, interconnected by miles of passageways that transformed entire islands into 3-dimensional battlefields where the rules of conventional warfare no longer applied. Private First Class Robert Leader would later recall his first encounter with these subterranean labyrinths with words that captured the collective horror of thousands. "We called them invisible holes in rocks. You could stand 5 feet from an entrance and never see it. Then suddenly, Japanese soldiers would pour out like angry wasps, screaming, firing, cutting men down before disappearing back into the earth. It was like fighting ghosts." To understand the terror these tunnels inspired, one must first grasp the context of the Pacific War in its final, most brutal phase. By early 1945, Japan's defeat was mathematically certain. American forces had pushed westward across thousands of miles of ocean, capturing islands in a bloody succession that brought B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese homeland. Saipan had fallen. The Philippines were being liberated. The once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy lay scattered across the Pacific floor. Yet this certainty of ultimate victory made the fighting no less savage, and in many ways, far more terrible. The Japanese High Command understood that they could not win a conventional victory. Instead, they adopted a strategy designed to make every inch of captured territory cost American lives in such staggering numbers that the United States would negotiate a conditional peace rather than pay the price for total conquest. This doctrine of decisive battle transformed defensive warfare into something approaching suicidal fanaticism, where Japanese soldiers were expected to kill at least 10 Americans before dying themselves. The tunnels became the physical embodiment of this philosophy. Fortresses designed not to hold territory, but to create killing zones where American technological and numerical superiority meant nothing. Construction of these underground complexes had often begun months or even years before American forces arrived. On Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi oversaw the excavation of 11 miles of tunnels connecting hundreds of pillboxes, gun emplacements, and command posts. Korean laborers and Japanese soldiers worked with hand tools, pneumatic drills, and explosives, carving through volcanic basalt in heat that regularly exceeded 140 degrees. Fahrenheit sulfur fumes from the island's volcanic vents made breathing difficult and corroded metal equipment. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and suffocation. Some sections required concrete reinforcement to prevent collapse. Others incorporated natural lava tubes that twisted through the island's geology, like arteries in a living body. The tunnels varied in sophistication from island to island, but they shared common features that made them nightmarish to assault. Multiple entrances and exits meant that sealing one entrance accomplished nothing. Rooms branched off main corridors at irregular intervals. some serving as ammunition storage, others as field hospitals, barracks, or command posts. Communication wires ran through the tunnels, allowing defenders to coordinate attacks across wide areas. Ventilation shafts provided air and, crucially, alternate firing positions. Some tunnels included rooms large enough to house artillery pieces that could be rolled to firing positions, discharge dozens of rounds, and then be withdrawn before American counter-battery fire could respond. The complexity of these systems became apparent during the initial American assaults. Marines who had trained for conventional warfare, advancing under covering fire, taking enemy positions through frontal assault or flanking maneuvers, found their tactical doctrine rendered obsolete. A position cleared in the morning would be reoccupied by evening, Japanese soldiers emerging from hidden entrances to attack field hospitals, command posts, or supply dumps. Artillery and naval bombardment, so devastating in previous campaigns, proved largely ineffective against enemies protected by dozens of feet of solid rock. Corporal Anthony Bartoletti of the 5th Marine Division described the psychological toll of this invisible enemy. You'd take a hill at dawn, count your dead, dig in by noon, you'd start hearing sounds below you. Tapping, voices speaking Japanese. You'd realize the entire hill was hollow, and somewhere beneath your feet, maybe 10 feet down, maybe 50, enemy soldiers were moving, planning, waiting. You couldn't sleep, you couldn't relax. Every square foot of ground felt like it might suddenly vomit up armed men determined to kill you. The Marines adapted with characteristic improvisation and brutal efficiency. Flamethrowers became essential weapons for tunnel warfare. Teams carrying these bulky, dangerous devices would approach suspected tunnel entrances, while riflemen provided covering fire. The flamethrower operator would send a jet of burning fuel into the opening, the jellied gasoline clinging to walls and turning confined spaces into incinerators. The results were horrific, but effective. Men caught in these infernos died quickly, or worse, fled deeper into tunnel systems, where they either suffocated from smoke inhalation or eventually succumbed to burns in darkness. Satchel charges and pole charges, explosives attached to long poles or thrown into tunnel mouths, provided another method of neutralization. Combat engineers became specialists in explosive placement, calculating how much TNT was needed to collapse a tunnel without endangering nearby Marines. They worked under constant threat, as Japanese defenders often waited until Americans approached before opening fire or detonating their own explosives in suicide attacks that buried attacker and defender alike. Grenades proved useful but unpredictable in tunnel fighting. A grenade thrown into an entrance might roll down an incline and explode harmlessly in an empty chamber, or it might kill multiple defenders clustered in the corridor beyond. Some Marines developed techniques of cooking off grenades, holding them after pulling the pin to reduce the time defenders had to throw them back or take cover. This required nerve and precise timing. One miscalculation meant the grenade exploded in the thrower's hand. The most dangerous job fell to those who entered the tunnels themselves. These men crawled into darkness armed with pistols, knives, and flashlights, never knowing if the next corner concealed an enemy soldier, a booby trap, or simply more empty corridor, stretching into blackness. The air in these tunnels was frequently toxic, filled with sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide from explosives, or simply depleted of oxygen. Men emerged gasping, sometimes hallucinating, their uniforms soaked with sweat despite the underground chill. Marine Private Eugene Sledge, whose memoir, With the Old Breed, remains one of the finest accounts of Pacific combat, described the Okinawa caves and tunnels in terms that captured their otherworldly horror. We could never see the enemy. We could only see the muzzle flashes from cave mouths and the results of their fire. Men screaming, clutching wounds, dying. We'd call in artillery or airstrikes on suspected positions, and sometimes we'd get secondary explosions that told us we'd hit something important, but mostly the shells just bounced off the rocks or exploded harmlessly while the Japanese sat deep underground, waiting for us to come close enough to kill. The integration of natural caves with man-made tunnels on Okinawa created defensive positions that required new tactics to overcome. The Marines and Army units that fought there developed combined arms approaches where infantry, armor, artillery, and air support worked in coordination. Tanks equipped with flamethrowers could approach cave mouths and pour burning fuel into openings, while infantry protected the tanks from Japanese soldiers armed with magnetic mines and suicide bombs. Artillery would fire white phosphorus rounds to mark targets for aircraft, which would then drop napalm, jellied gasoline bombs that spread fire across hillsides and could penetrate into cave systems through ventilation openings. The effectiveness of these tactics came at tremendous cost to Japanese defenders, but also raised moral questions that some Americans struggled with. The line between military necessity and massacre became blurred when entire cave systems were sealed with explosives or burning fuel, while civilians sheltered inside alongside soldiers. On several occasions, Marines attempting to evacuate Okinawan civilians from caves were fired upon by Japanese soldiers who preferred to kill the civilians rather than allow them to surrender. In other instances, civilians committed suicide rather than face capture, indoctrinated by Japanese propaganda that promised torture and death at American hands. These tragedies illustrated how the tunnel warfare system transformed not just military tactics, but the entire moral landscape of the Pacific Campaign. The claustrophobic brutality of fighting in and around these underground fortresses brought out both the worst and best in human nature. Acts of extraordinary courage occurred daily. Marines charging machine gun nests to save wounded comrades, corpsmen treating casualties under fire, combat engineers deliberately drawing fire to locate hidden positions. Yet this same environment also produced atrocities, moments when exhausted, terrified men made decisions that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The role of technology in countering the tunnel systems expanded as the war progressed. Military intelligence specialists studied captured tunnel layouts, attempting to understand Japanese engineering principles and predict where new tunnels might be located. Aerial reconnaissance photographs were analyzed for telltale signs: disturbed earth, ventilation openings, patterns of vegetation that might indicate underground construction. Sound detection equipment was deployed to listen for underground activity, though the volcanic geology of many Pacific islands made this technology unreliable. One innovation that proved valuable was the increased use of armored bulldozers, which could seal tunnel entrances with earth and rock, effectively burying defenders alive. These bulldozers, operated by Navy Seabees and Marine engineers, worked under constant fire, their operators protected by armor plating that could not always stop determined Japanese attacks. Some operators were killed when defenders emerged from tunnels behind the bulldozers and attacked with explosives or close-range weapons. Others were shot through viewing slits or killed when mines detonated beneath their vehicles. The psychological warfare dimension of tunnel fighting also evolved. Loudspeakers broadcasting surrender appeals in Japanese were positioned near known tunnel entrances, promising food, water, and medical care to those who gave up. These appeals occasionally succeeded, particularly late in campaigns when Japanese soldiers faced starvation and knew that relief was impossible. More often, they were answered with gunfire or silence, Some Marines reported hearing singing or chanting from deep within tunnel systems, Japanese soldiers preparing for death with traditional songs or Buddhist prayers that echoed through stone corridors in ways that were simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling. Marine Private Eugene Sledge, whose memoir, With the Old Breed, remains one of the finest accounts of Pacific combat, described the Okinawa caves and tunnels in terms that captured their otherworldly horror. We could never see the enemy. We could only see the muzzle flashes from cave mouths and the results of their fire. Men screaming, clutching wounds, dying. We'd call in artillery or airstrikes on suspected positions, and sometimes we'd get secondary explosions that told us we'd hit something important, but mostly the shells just bounced off the rocks or exploded harmlessly while the Japanese sat deep underground, waiting for us to come close enough to kill. The integration of natural caves with man-made tunnels on Okinawa created defensive positions that required new tactics to overcome. The Marines and Army units that fought there developed combined arms approaches where infantry, armor, artillery, and air support worked in coordination. Tanks equipped with flamethrowers could approach cave mouths and pour burning fuel into openings, while infantry protected the tanks from Japanese soldiers armed with magnetic mines and suicide bombs. Artillery would fire white phosphorus rounds to mark targets for aircraft, which would then drop napalm, jellied gasoline bombs that spread fire across hillsides and could penetrate into cave systems through ventilation openings. The effectiveness of these tactics came at tremendous cost to Japanese defenders, but also raised moral questions that some Americans struggled with. The line between military necessity and massacre became blurred when entire cave systems were sealed with explosives or burning fuel, while civilians sheltered inside alongside soldiers. On several occasions, Marines attempting to evacuate Okinawan civilians from caves were fired upon by Japanese soldiers who preferred to kill the civilians rather than allow them to surrender. In other instances, civilians committed suicide rather than face capture, indoctrinated by Japanese propaganda that promised torture and death at American hands. These tragedies illustrated how the tunnel warfare system transformed not just military tactics, but the entire moral landscape of the Pacific Campaign. The claustrophobic brutality of fighting in and around these underground fortresses brought out both the worst and best in human nature. Acts of extraordinary courage occurred daily. Marines charging machine gun nests to save wounded comrades, corpsmen treating casualties under fire, combat engineers deliberately drawing fire to locate hidden positions. Yet this same environment also produced atrocities, moments when exhausted, terrified men made decisions that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The role of technology in countering the tunnel systems expanded as the war progressed. Military intelligence specialists studied captured tunnel layouts, attempting to understand Japanese engineering principles and predict where new tunnels might be located. Aerial reconnaissance photographs were analyzed for telltale signs: disturbed earth, ventilation openings, patterns of vegetation that might indicate underground construction. Sound detection equipment was deployed to listen for underground activity, though the volcanic geology of many Pacific islands made this technology unreliable. One innovation that proved valuable was the increased use of armored bulldozers, which could seal tunnel entrances with earth and rock, effectively burying defenders alive. These bulldozers, operated by Navy Seabees and Marine engineers, worked under constant fire, their operators protected by armor plating that could not always stop determined Japanese attacks. Some operators were killed when defenders emerged from tunnels behind the bulldozers and attacked with explosives or close-range weapons. Others were shot through viewing slits or killed when mines detonated beneath their vehicles. The psychological warfare dimension of tunnel fighting also evolved. Loudspeakers broadcasting surrender appeals in Japanese were positioned near known tunnel entrances, promising food, water, and medical care to those who gave up. These appeals occasionally succeeded, particularly late in campaigns when Japanese soldiers faced starvation and knew that relief was impossible. More often, they were answered with gunfire or silence. Some Marines reported hearing singing or chanting from deep within tunnel systems, Japanese soldiers preparing for death with traditional songs or Buddhist prayers that echoed through stone corridors in ways that were simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling. Sergeant William Gnaust, a combat photographer, filmed inside captured tunnels on Iwo Jima, his footage revealing the scale and sophistication of Japanese engineering. The films show rooms large enough to stand in, walls reinforced with timber or concrete, ammunition stacked in organized piles, medical supplies arranged on shelves, electric lights hung from ceilings in some sections. One room contained office furniture, papers scattered across a desk, where a Japanese officer had been planning operations until moments before the Marines broke through. Gnaust was killed by machine gun fire from another tunnel entrance while filming the flag raising on Mount Suribachi, his death illustrating the persistent danger these hidden positions posed even in supposedly secured areas. The psychological dimension of tunnel warfare extended beyond simple fear of ambush. Marines reported feeling that the islands themselves had become hostile, that solid ground could not be trusted. Some men refused to sleep inside captured Japanese bunkers, even when offered protection from artillery. Others became paranoid, hearing movements and voices in their heads that might have been real threats or might have been exhaustion-induced hallucinations. Combat fatigue rates soared. Medical officers noted that many Marines exhibited symptoms similar to those seen in the trench warfare of World War I: uncontrollable shaking, inability to eat, 1,000-yard stares that seemed to look through rather than at people. The Japanese defenders, for their part, endured conditions that bordered on the unlivable. Cut off from resupply, they subsisted on dwindling rations of rice and water collected from seepage through volcanic rock. Medical care was minimal. Wounded men died slowly in darkness, their screams echoing through stone corridors. Disease spread rapidly in the confined spaces, yet Japanese soldiers continued fighting with a determination that Americans found both admirable and horrifying, a willingness to die that seemed to transcend rational calculation. This determination manifested most dramatically in the Banzai charges that Japanese commanders sometimes ordered as final acts of defiance. The term Banzai charge comes from the battle cry Tenno Heika Banzai, meaning "Long live the Emperor." These were not tactical maneuvers in any conventional sense, but rather mass suicide attacks, where hundreds of soldiers armed with rifles, swords, and sometimes only sharpened sticks would rush American positions in wave after wave, accepting certain death in exchange for the possibility of breaking enemy lines, or at least inflicting maximum casualties before their inevitable annihilation. The relationship between Banzai charges and the tunnel systems varied by location and commander. On Saipan in July 1944, one of the war's largest Banzai charges saw between 3,000 and 4,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians emerge from caves and charge American positions near Tanapag. The attack came at dawn, masses of men screaming through the darkness, overrunning 2 Marine battalions before being stopped by artillery and sustained rifle fire. American casualties exceeded 600. Japanese casualties approached total annihilation, but the psychological impact on the Americans who survived was profound and lasting. General Kuribayashi at Iwo Jima explicitly forbade Banzai charges in his defensive plans. He had studied American tactics and understood that such attacks wasted soldiers who could be more effectively employed in prolonged defensive fighting from fortified positions. His orders emphasized patience, concealment, and the extraction of maximum American casualties per Japanese soldier lost. For weeks, his troops followed this doctrine, bleeding the Marines yard by yard across the island's 8 square miles. Only at the end, when ammunition and water ran out and further organized resistance became impossible, did starving, desperate Japanese soldiers emerge for a final, desperate assault that accomplished nothing except adding to the body count. On Okinawa, the war's last major battle, the pattern repeated with variations. The island's rugged terrain and extensive cave systems provided even more opportunities for tunnel warfare than Iwo Jima Japanese forces, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, constructed defensive lines anchored on ridges, honeycombed with caves, and connected by tunnels. The fighting lasted 82 days, April through June 1945, and cost more American casualties than any other Pacific campaign. Over 12,000 Americans died, and 36,000 were wounded. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000, and civilian casualties approached the same number in a campaign that devastated the island's population. More recently, tunnel warfare has emerged as a central challenge in conflicts against non-state actors. The tunnels used by Hamas in Gaza, by ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and by the Taliban in Afghanistan all echo the defensive principles first employed on a massive scale by Japanese forces in World War II. Exploit geography, create depth, force attackers into close-quarters combat where technological advantages are minimized, and inflict casualties out of proportion to defender numbers. The Israeli Defense Forces' experiences fighting in urban tunnel networks have led to new technological solutions: robotic reconnaissance, ground-penetrating radar, specialized explosives that build on foundations laid in the Pacific 8 decades ago. The human cost of the Pacific tunnel warfare remains difficult to fully quantify. Official casualty figures capture deaths and physical wounds, but cannot measure the psychological damage, the marriages destroyed by men unable to readjust to civilian life, the careers truncated by drinking or drug abuse as veterans attempted to self-medicate trauma, the decades of nightmares and survivor guilt. Many Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and other islands never spoke about their experiences, finding the memories too painful or believing that those who had not been there could never understand. Some veterans, however, felt compelled to record their experiences for posterity. Their memoirs, oral histories, and interviews provide invaluable insights into the reality of tunnel warfare beyond the sanitized official accounts. They describe the weight of the flamethrower on a man's back, the specific sound of Japanese grenades detonating in confined spaces, the smell of sulfur and death that clung to clothing and skin, the exhaustion so profound that men would fall asleep, standing up despite the danger. They recall specific faces of friends who died, Japanese prisoners who offered cigarettes or water, despite having none themselves, moments of terror that lasted seconds but felt like hours. The Japanese perspective on the tunnel warfare has been less thoroughly documented, partly because so few defenders survived to tell their stories. Those accounts that do exist describe the gradual deterioration of conditions as American forces tightened their grip on each island. Food ran out, water became scarce, ammunition dwindled, wounded men could not be evacuated. The Americans above ground controlled the surface entirely, making emergence in daylight suicidal. Some defenders chose to die by their own hand, rather than face starvation or capture. Others fought until their last bullet, then died in final charges that accomplished nothing but confirmed their loyalty to emperor and nation. The engineering achievement represented by the tunnel systems deserves recognition separate from their military purpose. The labor required to excavate miles of tunnel through solid volcanic rock with limited mechanical equipment was extraordinary. The structural integrity of tunnels that survived direct hits from battleship shells and 1,000-pound bombs testified to sophisticated understanding of load-bearing principles and blast dynamics. The ventilation systems that provided breathable air dozens of feet underground demonstrated practical problem-solving under severe resource constraints. That all this was accomplished while American submarines throttled supply lines and American aircraft controlled the skies makes the achievement more remarkable, even as the purpose, prolonging a lost war, remained fundamentally tragic. The cultural legacy of the Pacific Tunnel warfare extends beyond military history into broader American consciousness. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa occupy symbolic spaces in national memory, representing both American determination in the face of fanatical resistance and the terrible costs of total war. The famous photograph of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi has become one of the most reproduced images in American history, though few who view it understand that even after that moment of apparent triumph, weeks of brutal fighting remained, much of it centered on clearing the tunnel systems that riddled the island beneath the flag. For Japanese memory, the battles represent complex and often contradictory meanings. Pride in the courage and dedication of defenders who fought impossible odds exists alongside recognition that their sacrifice was futile, that the tunnel systems and Banzai charges only prolonged suffering without altering the war's inevitable outcome. The transformation of Iwo Jima and Okinawa from military fortresses to sites of commemoration and reconciliation reflects broader Japanese processing of the war's legacy, though debates continue regarding how to remember and teach about this period. The physical remnants of the tunnel systems persist across the Pacific. On Iwo Jima, closed to general visitors and serving as a Japanese military base, miles of tunnels remain largely as they were in 1945, sealed or collapsed, but still present beneath the volcanic sand and rock. Okinawa's extensive cave networks attract tourists and history enthusiasts, though many sections remain closed due to safety concerns or undiscovered explosives. Archaeological and historical research continues, uncovering artifacts and human remains that provide new insights into the daily reality of subterranean warfare. The final assessment of the Pacific Tunnel warfare must acknowledge its place within the larger tragedy of World War II. The ingenuity of Japanese engineering and the courage of their soldiers, like the bravery and resourcefulness of the Marines who fought them, occurred within a context of militarism, imperialism, and ideological fanaticism that produced suffering on a scale difficult to comprehend. The tunnels themselves were symptoms of a strategic deadlock where neither side could achieve objectives without accepting casualties that, in a more rational calculation, would have been deemed unacceptable. The young Americans who crawled into those tunnels with flashlights and pistols, who aimed flamethrowers into darkness, who threw grenades into openings and listened for screams that confirmed hits, were not monsters. They were, in most cases, ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, fighting an enemy who had been dehumanized by propaganda and who seemed to confirm that dehumanization through willingness to die rather than surrender, that many of these men later regretted their actions, that they struggled with what they had done and seen, suggests that the moral categories of wartime, necessary, justified, heroic, failed to adequately describe their actual experiences. Similarly, the Japanese soldiers who died in those tunnels, who fought to the last round, and then charged into machine gun fire with bayonets or bare hands, were not the fanatical subhumans of American propaganda, but human beings trapped in a system that offered them no alternative to death. Their willingness to endure starvation, disease, and certain death in defense of an emperor most had never seen, and a cause that offered no hope of success, reflected indoctrination and military discipline, but also, in many cases, genuine belief in duty and honor as they understood those concepts. The 21st century perspective on these events must balance respect for the courage and sacrifice shown by individuals on both sides, with clear-eyed recognition of the larger failures of leadership, ideology, and diplomacy that made such sacrifice necessary. The tunnel warfare of the Pacific was not glorious. It was not noble. It was brutal, horrific, and ultimately wasteful of human potential. That it produced acts of individual heroism and demonstrated human capacity for endurance under extreme conditions does not redeem its fundamental tragedy. As the last veterans of the Pacific War pass from living memory into history, the responsibility for preserving their stories and learning from their experiences falls to subsequent generations. The tunnels they fought through or defended have become metaphors for the hidden dimensions of war, the unglamorous, terrifying reality that exists beneath the surface of grand strategy and patriotic narrative. Understanding what happened in those dark passages, what men experienced, and how they were changed, provides essential context for evaluating not just World War II, but warfare itself as a human phenomenon. The invisible holes in rocks that Private Leader described on Iwo Jima were not just tactical challenges, but windows into the extremes of human behavior under stress. They revealed how quickly civilized norms could dissolve when survival was at stake, how thin the membrane separating soldier from killer, hero from traumatized victim. They demonstrated that technological superiority alone could not guarantee victory when enemies were willing to sacrifice everything for incremental, tactical advantages. Most importantly, they showed that even in humanity's darkest moments, individuals could still make choices that reflected compassion, mercy, and recognition of shared humanity across the boundaries of language, culture, and war. The legacy of the Pacific Tunnel warfare thus extends far beyond military history into fundamental questions about human nature, the costs of conflict, and the responsibilities of nations that choose war as policy. Every veteran who emerged from those tunnels carried memories that shaped the remainder of their lives. Every family that lost a son or father in those dark passages paid a price that victory could not fully repay. Every Japanese family that never learned the fate of men who disappeared into caves and tunnels carries an absence that 8 decades have not filled. These individual traumas, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of lives, constitute the true cost of the strategic decisions made in Tokyo and Washington during those years. As we remember the tunnel warfare of the Pacific, we honor not the cause or the strategy, but the individuals who endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. We acknowledge their suffering without glorifying the system that produced it. We study their tactics and technologies while recognizing that the real lessons are human rather than military, and we commit to carrying forward their stories, not as celebration of war, but as testimony to its costs, in hopes that future generations might find better ways to resolve conflicts than sending young men to kill each other in darkness beneath the earth.